Hello everyone, welcome to Anthropology Analytica. I'm Dr. Arjun Bopanna, your anthropology faculty at InsightsIAS. In today's video, we shall try to answer this question, discuss the basic tenet of American diffusion. So as you know, diffusion is a theory in anthropology explaining the growth of culture. So according to diffusion, culture growth takes place because of transmission of culture. And diffusion, there are three schools based on the nationality of the theorists. So you have British diffusionists, you have German diffusionists, and the American diffusion. So over here, we will have to write about the basic tenets about American diffusion. So in this, let's see the structure of this particular question. So we'll have to write an introduction, the basic context. Then we'll have to write about the contributions made by two American diffusionists, that is Clark Whistler and Alfred Lewis Kroeber. In the conclusion, we can talk about the legacy of American diffusion and the criticism. Okay, so this is the structure of your answer. So in the introduction, as I told you, about 3 to 4 sentences, you should write about the context. Where did this idea of American diffusion come into existence, or what was the influence or the background behind this? So as you all know, American diffusionism was influenced by museum methodology and geographical categories. Arrangement of cultural elements in a museum based on geographical geographical factors, as well as cultural similarities from that particular geography. Okay, so that is the museum methodology. Along with that, it was also influenced by historical particularism of Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, and also the concept of culture area, which was influenced by O.T. Mason, again a museum curator at the National Museum, National Museum, U.S. National Museum, who gave the concept of O.T. Mason gave the concept of ethnic environment. Ethnic environment. So this was later renamed as culture area. So this is the brief background. So you will have to write about museum methodology and geographical categories, Franz Boas's historical particularism, and O.T. Mason's ethnic environment. All of this influenced the idea of American diffusion, where Clark Whistler and Alfred Lewis Kroeber developed these ideas into their theories. So Clark Whistler basically talks about culture areas. Yeah, so that is the introduction, about 3 to 4 sentence of introduction you can write. And then you move on to the next paragraph where you will talk about the Clark Whistler and his contribution. So you will be talking about culture area and, culture center, and then age area concept. All these three things in 3 separate paragraphs you'll have to write. So what is this culture area, and how he tried to divide the Americas into different culture area, on what basis it was done, draw a diagram also of culture areas, etc. And then you also have to write about the culture center. See, for example, he pointed out that in each culture area you had a culture center. This was a core area where all socio-economic, political, religious activities were controlled and governed, and from there diffusion took place. That's what he says with respect to culture area. Okay, so if you look at what all you will have to write for culture center and culture area. So basically culture area is geographical zone with number of groups who show cultural similarity. So what is culture area? It is a geographical zone, okay, having number of groups and who show cultural similarity. See, for example, for coming up with American culture areas, he used food. Okay, because food was influenced both by culture as well as environment. So using food as a cultural aspect. Okay, so he divided America into 6 food areas. Okay, he divided America into 6 food area. And later he developed this concept more and expanded it towards the entire America, and identified 15 culture areas. Okay, so he improvised the previous one and identified 10 culture areas in North America, 4 in South America, and 1 in Caribbean. So this way, culture areas. So see, he was trying to explain it in America. This can be applied across the world also. So in America, he divided America into different culture areas, okay, or food areas, and initially 6 and then later developed into 15. You don't have to go into details of the names. You can just mention 1 or 2 names, but then you can elaborate on the explanation part of it. Okay, so basically he took food as the most basic factor which influenced by both culture and environment, and he gave a list of 6 basic areas. And later he says that in this culture area you have culture center. So every culture area has a center, and this is a place where all cultural traits typically appear. The greatest concentration of trait is found in this particular area in its pristine form. So all the socio-economic, political, religious activities are controlled and governed in this culture center. And this is from where diffusion takes place. So now if you take, this is a culture area, and if this is a culture center, and this is culture area. So diffusion happens from this culture center is what he says. So as you move away from the culture center, it starts to dilute. As you move away from it, it starts to dilute, and finally it disappears, giving rise to a new culture area. So as a new trait starts to appear, it gives rise to new culture area. This is how diffusion of culture occurs, and he explained this in the form of culture area and culture center. He also says that the distance through which this culture trait has diffused also gives or indicates the age of that particular area. If the culture area has if the cultural trait has diffused for a larger area, that is an older culture according to him. Okay, so this is about the concept of culture area. Similarly, Alfred Lewis Kroeber also talks about diffusion, but his idea is slightly different, where he talks about rise and fall of civilization. So according to Alfred Kroeber, and he uses this word culture climax. So that also has to be there in your answer. Okay, so he talks about rise and fall of civilization. So he began with the idea about this concept, saying that civilization is a culture complex. He says civilization is a culture complex and emerged from a lot of borrowing from other culture. So as these borrowed elements started to merge with each other, they became somewhat like a chain of culture. So as different cultures are carried forward, they all evolve into what is known as civilization, and thereby reached the final point, which he called it as culture climax. Okay, so what is civilization according to him? He says it emerged as a lot of borrowing from other cultures. So let's say lot of culture starts to be borrowed, okay, at a place, and culture reaches its highest level. So this is where civilization comes into being. So it emerged from lot of borrowing from other cultures. As the borrowed culture started to get systematized and modified and transformed, it became a chain of culture. As it became a chain of culture, it evolved or rose into civilization, which is the final point, which he called it as culture climax. So it is somewhat like culture area. See over here, if you compare the culture area and the idea of culture climax, in culture area you have culture center where diffusion takes place outside, it goes out. Whereas in case of culture climax, so culture from different parts starts to diffuse at one place, and it starts to rise over here, giving rise to what is known as civilization. All right, so this is the idea of Alfred Lewis Kroeber. So that is what you can talk about in both Clark Wissler and Alfred Kroeber. Okay, after that, you will have to give a conclusion. In the conclusion, you can either give criticism of American diffusion, saying that it is a very vague concept. How can you try to give the number of culture areas? It can vary. Too much emphasis was given on culture center or culture climax. There was no explanation why cultural trait was accepted, rejected, or modified, etc. So just again, 4 to 5 sentence of criticism, and finally the legacy and what was the legacy or influence of American diffusion. So you can also say, for example, this idea of Alfred Kroeber of culture climax and civilization was taken forward by Robert Redfield to come up with this idea of great tradition and little tradition, which in turn gave rise to an entire study of civilization or civilizational school of studies. So that is the legacy of Alfred Kroeber. Okay, so its idea influenced civilization school of thought. Okay, so this is the basic tenet of American diffusion. In your answer, therefore, you'll have to write briefly about the introduction, the context, and talk about Clark Whistler, culture area, culture center, and age area concept, and Alfred Lewis Kroeber's rise and fall of civilization. And in the conclusion, a little bit about the criticism, and finally, the legacy of American diffusion. In the next video, we will try and understand the concept of tributary mode of production.